Hello and welcome to our penultimate episode of A Question of Property. I'm your host, Lucia France, and joining me are our usual panel of property experts who are primed and ready to fight it out and see who's going to give the best advice for our viewers. So good morning, first of all, to John Howard. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning. That's fighting talk, isn't it? And as you know, I got told off by, I've had a few viewers have told me off for being too aggressive towards solicitors. Whether they're worse solicitors anyway, I don't know. But so I've also got to calm down a bit.
Was it friends of Stefano, do you think?
Well, I'd imagine. I wouldn't have thought he's got any friends, so I wouldn't have thought that's the case.
Oh dear.
Did you get a dead horse head in your bed one night?
That's obviously an Italian job, isn't it? That?
It's a mafia job.
Well, it wouldn't be hard to guess who's done that.
Right, okay, let's hold it there, guys.
Long as it's not one of my horses outside, I'm okay. I'll be happy.
Well, it was due to run at Newmarket at 1:30 today, mate. Hard luck.
We don't condone any abuse to animals here on this show.
We don't. We're animal lovers.
John has 40 years experience in the industry. If you've been watching, you'll know this. And he's the author of 3 different books on the subject, including Buying and Selling at Auction. And he's working on a 4th. We're going to say good morning as well to Stefano Lucatello, Senior Partner at Cobalt Law International Property Lawyers, and our go-to for advice on buying and selling property abroad, as well as being a top-notch lawyer. Stefano is also very handy in the kitchen.
Yes.
So what's been the top recipe this week?
Lobster bisque and lobster salad this week.
Ooh,
Fresh delivery from Cornwall. I've got a big container full of fish to cook over the next few weeks, so keep watching this space. Watch me on Facebook. You'll see all these beautiful recipes.
Awesome.
Very eco-friendly, that, isn't it? All the way from Cornwall to Hull.
No, London.
Well, even so.
Okay.
Come on.
As long as we don't see any sort of fish-based desserts, I'm fine with that.
There's no fish panna cotta.
Okay, good.
God for that.
And last but of course not least, welcome to Paul Mahoney, who is not only has 1 but 2 university degrees, and he's also a best-selling author, award-winning property speaker, and head of Nova Financial Group. So morning to you, Paul. How are you today?
Thanks, Lucia. I'm very good, thank you.
Are you going to keep the peace between these two, please?
I'll do my best.
Amazing what you can buy on eBay nowadays, isn't it? Titles.
Well, it's got to be the most intelligent Australian ever.
Whoa!
Oh my goodness! Whoa. Right, we are going to leave that there.
Come on, let's get on with it, Lucia.
And let's get on with it. Just our first question to all of you. It's obviously our penultimate episode. We've been filming now for 10 weeks.
Wow.
Most of which has been in a fairly tight lockdown here in the UK. So what's the strangest thing any of you have had to do for yourself during lockdown? Let's go first. John, yes.
Hoovering. I've been hoovering and also emptying the dishwasher every morning.
Wow.
And I'll tell you what, I'm not used to any of that. I'm normally very spoiled.
Who does it usually then?
The housekeeper had the opportunity to come back and she said no.
I'm not surprised.
Well, fair enough, I think. Stefano?
I can't think. Probably trying to cut my own hair.
What little's left of it. Very nice.
I'm not saying a word.
Paul?
You can't talk.
Well, I let my wife cut my hair, and that was a bit dodgy. Luckily, our cleaner is back now, so we're living in a clean house.
We don't have a cleaner. We do it ourselves up north.
Right.
None of this lark.
Well, everybody's hair looks great, I have to say. So, yeah.
What's your strangest moment, Lucia?
Waxing my own legs.
Oh, darling, what a problem.
I thought you said you got your husband to do that.
Yeah, he did. He had to do the back because I couldn't reach.
See?
Anyway, let's move on.
Too much information.
Too much. TMI there. Right, let's go talk about some property then, shall we? First question here is for Paul. So, when people quote, say, a 6% yield on a buy-to-let property, have they normally taken into account any repairs or service charge that may have to be paid? And that one's for you, Paul.
Okay. Yeah, so returns with regards to property can be quoted in a number of different ways. And usually the most common is, and probably what this person is talking about, is the gross yield. Right. So when somebody says 6%, they're more than likely talking about the rent as a percentage of the property price. And that's the gross yield without taking away any costs. But there's other ways of looking at returns, and probably much better ways of looking at returns. You can look at the net yield on the property, meaning that you've taken all the costs out of the rent. But one step further, which I think is an even more important figure, is the net yield on the funds applied, or your ROI, your return on investment. So, you know, for example, £50,000 into a £200,000 property with a 75% mortgage, the net yield after all costs as a percentage of the cash you've invested being the 50 grand. Now, I think that's the most important figure when talking about yield, because the asset returns aren't really all that relevant to you as the property investor, because it's the cash or the equity that you've got invested in that property that's most important. Because, you know, you could do with that whatever you like. You could invest it in stocks and shares. You could keep it in the bank, you know, shove it under your bed. You've decided to invest it in this property, and therefore the most important figure is the return you're getting on that cash. So I'd encourage people to do that. And the way you work that out is you just take, you know, your yearly rent minus all of your costs. So things like your monthly mortgage cost, management, service charges, ground rent, maintenance, everything in property. Always do that quite conservatively, because it's usually a bit of a forecast as opposed to actual figures. So conservative rent, you know, build a bit of a buffer into the costs, and then take that, then divide that by the cash invested. And that will give you your net yield on cash applied.
Sorry, Paul, just to clarify, you said divide that by the cash invested there.
Yeah, so divide, exactly, yeah. So divide the yearly rent by the cash invested, and that will give you your net yield on funds applied. And in the current market, a good net yield on funds applied, it does depend on locations, but usually what we're aiming for is somewhere between 5 to 10%.
Okay.
So that will be post expenses, pre-tax yield.
So where would you get 10% now, Paul? Which city?
So Liverpool, Leeds, where the property prices are a little bit cheaper than the likes of Birmingham, Manchester, and therefore the yields are a bit higher. It does depend on the type of the property price, the location, all that sort of thing. You can get much higher than that, but generally when you're going for much higher yields, you're also buying cheaper properties in cheaper areas. And therefore, in my view, you're taking more risk because the vacancy rates are often higher, the quality of tenant is lower. So it's a bit of a balancing act between having confidence in the return and you know, actually getting it.
Okay, that's great.
I think the other thing I would say, I think you're right there, Paul. I think the other thing, when you're looking at cheaper properties with higher yields, you're really sacrificing, you know, capital growth probably and quality for yield. And of course, unfortunately, sometimes, you know, the yield might sound great to start with, the rental return, but of course, it doesn't cost a lot less to refurbish a house in Burnley, say, all due respect to Burnley, as it does, you know, Leeds or somewhere else. So actually, you know, when you have to refurbish them, you're actually pro rata investing more money into that property for what it's worth than you are in another one. And also you're getting less capital gain over the long period of time as well, probably.
Yeah, we get a lot of people that come to us with properties in the northeast of England.
Yeah,
will give,
me too.
10% to 15% gross yields on the asset value, which is really high. When you work that on your cash, it's a significant return. But whether you're actually going to get that or not is the question, because the vacancy rates are higher, the quality of
you've got to look at, Hartlepool is a great example. Hartlepool has got the highest unemployment level in the UK and the biggest drug problem, one of the biggest drug problems at the moment. So, you know, in Northeast, you know, some of the areas in Northeast are lovely, by the way, I'm not saying they're not, but that would be an example. People said to me, look, I bought in Hartlepool and now I can't get my money back. Well, you know, do your research. We always say this on this show, on every show. Yeah. Do your research. You know, it's so important. And take some advice from people that know.
And get the right advice, like
for
you
sure.
yourself, Stefano, always say. John, sorry, I've just realised you've got a tie on.
Yes, I have got a tie on today.
Why is this? What's going on?
I just thought I would outsmart the others, to be honest with you, in more ways than one, probably. But there we go.
You've got a long way to go, mate, then. Keep trying.
Well, I haven't got a degree, I accept that, or even 2. I do accept that. But I have got MVQ3 in racehorse management, my only qualification.
That would be very useful.
Absolutely, absolutely.
If you've got a racehorse.
Let's move on. Stefano, it's your first question for today. We have a question from a solicitor in the UK who says, as a matter of interest, is there an equivalent to the Land Registry in any European countries? So,
yes. Next question.
He doesn't specify which.
Is that because you don't know the answer?
Yeah, abroad, land registries are called cadastral registers, and the cadaster is the word which derives from Latin, which means register, and which was used by the Roman centurions to count their stocks of food, their soldiers, and all the rest of the stuff that they were carting about. So that's where it comes from, the cadaster. And the cadaster is our form of land registry in Italy, Spain, Portugal. It's electronic, so you can do searches online on it. And the cadastral register will tell you, much the same way as our English land registry does, which is divided up into a property register, proprietorship register, and a charges register, what is on the title. So it'll tell you who owns the property, the share of ownership, because in foreign countries, in European countries, we have the civil law system, and you can own in fifths, sixths, sevenths, which is very unheard of in our common law jurisdiction. Yeah. So you could get families which each own a sixth, it's a sixth of them, and it'll tell you who owns what and where. It'll tell you the rights and the obligations of the property. It'll have a cadastral plan, which is the plan of the property showing you the perimeter of the property. Interestingly enough, abroad, when you have a plot of land and a property, each one of the two will have a separate land registry number and plot number. So you could have plots within plots within plots within subdivisions within this, that, and the other. So you can have external buildings attached to it with their own title number. Makes it quite complicated. And the interesting thing about cadastral registers, especially in Italy, is that the further north you go, in Trentino, which is in Alto Adige, which are the two regions close to Austria, the system of cadasters of registering property is based on the Austro-Hungarian system, which talks about fractions. So it's not decimals, it's fractions, and you have to, it's the only place in Italy where it's not electronic, and you have to do a manual search. So when we deal with clients who are buying up there, we have to send someone down to the local land registry to actually do a manual search, which means flicking through loads of books, finding the plots, and getting all the title problems off the register to then be able to advise the client. So yeah, the answer in short is yes, every European country has something called a cadaster, which is the equivalent of our land registry. Some cadasters have more information on, some countries have more information on the cadasters than others, but it is what we start off with when we start doing searches and start buying property for clients abroad.
It sounds like it could get really complicated there with all of the subdivisions. Does that often cause problems? Yeah,
it does. I mean, especially in northern Italy, as I say, because you're hand searching as opposed to electronic searching, and you imagine that it would take an absolute nightmare to sort that system out. Yeah, I mean, you've got to be very careful, and you've got to be, you know, my reputation's on the line when I'm talking to clients and I'm telling them, look, there's 6 people that own this, and making sure that there are 6 people.
Yeah.
And then just before completion, the notary, or the notaio in Italy, or the public authorities, I've always called him along this series, has to do another search to make sure that between exchange of contracts and completion, there hasn't, or the day before completion, there hasn't been any changes, such as a new charge being put on the property, or someone coming off the property, or someone having died, or whatever. So there's been no change to the registry cadaster.
Right, okay, great. Thanks very much, Stefano. A longer answer there. See, we got it out of you.
But it was complete. And
yeah, absolutely. Comprehensive indeed.
Professional.
Thank you.
Oh, John's being nice to you. That's good.
I'm trying.
You're very trying.
Okay, let's go on to John's first question then for today. This person says, I'm looking to purchase a commercial investment. I've come across one that looks quite interesting. Can you explain the distance to me, please, between a full repairing and insuring lease and an internal repair and insuring lease?
Okay, well, Stefano can probably do a better job than this than I can, but here we go. I'm sure he'll catch me out at some point.
Yeah.
So a full repairing and insuring lease means that they are taking on all the costs, all the insurance and the repair of the building. So when you get, say the rent's £10,000, you will get the £10,000 clear of any other costs. So that is a real genuine net. And that's the great thing about commercial, of course. You know, you're not then, unlike residential, you haven't got, if it's full repairing and insuring, That's what it means, full repairing and insuring. If it's internal repairing only and insurance only, it means they have to look after the interior as it is when they take it on normally, but they don't have to they don't have to look after the externals. That may be because there's a number of different tenants in the building, and if the guy or lady checks, she might find that there is what's called a service charge to cover all the external repairs. So they pay a share of the external repairs. They may not be. So that's the difference. And you definitely need to check. Also, the big thing you need to ask is when the tenant moved in, was there a schedule of works carried out? A schedule of condition, not work, schedule of condition. That can be done by photographs, which is the cheap way of doing it, so that when they leave the premises, they have to leave it in the same condition. So if it's not in the same condition, then there's dilapidations, which means they have to put it back into the condition it was when they took the building on in the first place. Stefano, how have I done?
Yeah,
how many out of 10?
Reasonably well. 7 out of 10.
Thank
7 out of 10.
Thank you.
The main
Would you like
point,
to add anything?
I was going to. The main point on a
Thought
full
you might.
repairing and insuring lease is that if you were to take it on without doing anything at the point of signing the lease, you would take on all the historic problems. So you could inherit
Yes.
a problem as a tenant.
Good point.
With any previous history, and it would be yours, incumbent on you to deal with it. As John
Yep.
says, when we deal with commercial leases, we always have a schedule of dilapidations attached to it with photography, if possible, which then shows the state of repair that it was in at the time. We always, as lawyers, try to water down a full repairing and insuring lease, and the
Of course you do. Yeah, of course you do. Of course you do.
It's incumbent on a solicitor to try and water it down, especially when the landlord's want to get away with something that perhaps he can pass on, like a roof or foundations, structural or whatever, which is going to cost him a lot of money and may not be covered by insurance. So he's going to try and put it onto a tenant. So the first thing we would do is we would look at the historical condition of the property. We'd have a survey done, and the survey would then possibly be attached to the property lease, and it would be watered down in some way, shape, or form. I always tell clients, be careful what you wish for, because you want the property, but if you're taking on an FRI, you've got a real problem.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much, Stefano, for that. And you wonder why I feel the way I do about lawyers. Thank you. Taking the bread from my mouth.
With the properties that you've invested in, John, then have you gone for a full repairing? And
yeah.
Oh, we lost you.
Who's gone? Oh, John.
Oh, we'll come back to John then. I think we just lost connection there. Okay, let's go back to Paul then for your second question for today. So Derek asks, I've heard John Howard recommending paying off your buy-to-let mortgage on a repayment basis as quickly as possible to save thousands of pounds in interest. Is that something that you would advise as well?
Well, we've obviously silenced John for a reason. It wasn't an accident. John's on pause.
Not intentional.
But I suppose that leads into my answer is that no, I don't agree with that necessarily. The reason I don't agree with that, and we get asked a lot of questions about, for buy-to-let, should I go for interest only or repayment mortgage? And my answer as a mortgage advisor and financial advisor is always interest only, because it's less risk. The reason it's less risk is you are committing to a lower level of payment, and keeping in mind this is an investment where you could potentially have cash flow issues down the line. And if you do have cash flow issues, you want to have the minimum level of commitment, outgoing commitments as possible to get you through that. Yeah. Now, with most interest-only mortgages, you can still repay up to 10% of the principal per annum anyway, but it's your choice. So, for example, even if it is interest-only, you could get that paid off within 10 years if you wanted to pay extra. But if it's principal and interest, you don't have a choice. You have to pay the principal. You have to make the repayments as well.
Right.
And this is especially so the case when you still have personal debt being a home loan, credit cards, car loans, the debts that improve our lifestyle but hurt our finances. you want to get rid of them as soon as you can. So definitely personal debts, you want those on repayment.
Yeah.
Definitely want to be paying them down. But investment debt is different, and certainly shouldn't really be paid down until you've got rid of your personal debt. The reason it's different is investment debt helps your finances. You know, it makes your money go further. It extends your buying power, especially whilst it's so cheap. You know, when we can borrow at 2 or 3% that's tax deductible, it makes sense to have it. Really, you know, regardless of your situation, I'm a big believer that unless you're extremely wealthy and you just don't want the hassle, and you've got enough resources to kind of give you what you want from your investments, it's almost madness not to have some mortgages against your properties, because it does it accelerates the returns. And a lot of people associate debt with risk more so than they do opportunity. Yeah. And I look at it the other way around, because the only risk of debt is the cost of the debt. And when it's so cheap, that risk is quite low. Because if we can be achieving strong double-digit returns from investing in property, and the cost of the debt is low single digits, then the risk is quite low.
Yeah. So in terms of paying things off, in terms of these loans as quickly as possible, that's not actually something that you would advise?
Not necessarily. And even carrying mortgages, buy-to-let mortgages, right through retirement can make sense, because you're not limited in getting buy-to-let mortgages by being retired. That you are limited getting personal debt. So, for example, getting a residential mortgage on your home, it becomes more difficult to get a mortgage when you get toward the age of 65. And the reason for that is your personal income is the serviceability for that mortgage. And therefore, most lenders will only lend to you 4 to 5 times your income, and they'll start to get worried as you get older, because they'll think, well, you're going to stop working at some point. How are you going to service this mortgage?
Paul, can you get a buy-to-let mortgage on an interest only?
Most of them are interest only. That's standard practice. Yeah. Standard practice.
I mean, I've never done an investment, but my only mortgage was an interest only with Halifax, which I took out in 1987 when we bought our house.
Yeah.
And it backed by 3 life endowment policies with Scottish Amicable and one of the others. And I know that getting towards the end of it, I was starting to get notifications from the insurance companies saying your endowment is not going to cover the repayment. Your endowment will only, and they have to quote, don't they, at certain percentages or interest rates as to what it's going to perform at and do. And in fact,
endowments are are a very old product. Yes, they don't really do them anymore.
So they don't exist anymore, right? Okay. Yeah, so that was my fear would be, yes, okay, fine, you take an interest-only mortgage, but can you repay it when it comes to the moment that you have to repay it at the end of 25, 15 years, whatever?
Well, that's the thing with buy-to-let. The serviceability is the rent from the property.
Yeah. And
the security is the property.
Yeah.
So some buy-to-let lenders will lend to you up to the age of 100.
Yeah.
And most of us don't live that long.
Wow.
You know, so it's not really, the reason for that is it's much more about the property than it is about your personal situation. So a lot of people get concerned about debt. And I think the thing you need to do is separate the difference between good debt and bad debt in your mind. Mm-hmm. It's worth having good debt. And you're you are underutilizing what you have if you don't have good debt.
Right.
But it's worth getting rid of bad debt, being personal debt. So, you know, we see people all the time that have, you know, debt-free properties or very low levels of debt against properties. Mm-hmm. And we go through an educational process with them to show them how they could be achieving so much more by, for example, taking some equity out of those properties and buying more properties, which multiplies their exposure to the market and therefore multiplies their returns.
Right.
So, Paul, just talking about not bad debt, but kind of things that you referred to before, such as like your car, you know, people that buy cars on a lease, and you know, would you say that's a bad debt kind of thing to have?
Well, a lease is a bit different, because so long as you can afford to service it and you can just hand the car back at the end, that's not necessarily a bad debt, because, as I say, so long as you're servicing it, it's not going to cause you an issue. But for example, your home loan is a bad debt. Most people have a home loan, but it's personal debt. It doesn't help your finances. It hurts your finances. It gives you a place to live. And, you know, I suppose that's the difference, is my home loan, where I'm talking to you from now, is a repayment mortgage. and you want to try to get rid of that as soon as you can.
Yeah.
Whereas with buy-to-let mortgages, or any investment debt for that matter, that should be carried until you've got no personal debt.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. Thank you for that, Paul, and Stefano as well.
He's back. Don't give him the opportunity to reply. Move on to the next question.
Okay.
I'm very sorry.
Sorry, John, we lost you there. Are you
My
okay?
internet kept falling out, so I do apologise. That's the only drawback to Suffolk. It's beautiful.
We've just been saying how wrong you are.
Glitch.
It was all it cut off at a kind of opportune moment there for the other guys. Right, Stefano, let's move on to your next question. This person says, I've been put off by some of the advice you've given regarding buying property in Europe. It doesn't sound that renting out a property there is easy or safe as doing so in the UK. And that would be my primary objective, return on investment. Have I misunderstood you? So,
every country has its own rules and regulations, and certainly buying property and then renting it out abroad is totally different from doing it here in the United Kingdom. When you set up, we've quite often touched on this during the 10 weeks that we've been talking, when you actually rent a property out in a foreign country, in a European country, let's say, there are rules and regulations which apply, and they mainly, as they do in any country, but they mainly benefit and protect the tenant. So it means that if you try as a landlord to be clever and have let's say a fixed term lease, which is a recurring lease, a 1-year lease, which then becomes a 5-year lease, the law states that automatically gives security of tenure in all the European civil law countries to the tenant. So yes, the odds are stacked very much in favor of the tenant in European jurisdictions. And yes, you've got to get your act together when you decide to rent it out, whether it's commercial or residential, 2 sets of different laws. And it's very important that you do think about it, because if your aim is to get it back at some point, you don't always, and this is the one point that differs in many European countries, you don't, like in the United Kingdom, have the right under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, for example, which deals with commercial leases, to get the property back if you fall under one of the cases, which is that you need it for your own occupation as the landlord. Right. Or you need to carry out works of reparation. They're one of the 2 of the 7 cases under the schedule that you can actually take back possession for when it's covered and protected. I mean, most leases nowadays in England are not protected. They fall outside the scope of the 1954 Act, Part 2. But anyway, abroad, you don't have that. And therefore, yes, it is very much stacked against it. No, I mean, there's nothing wrong in renting out a property. I would always rent out a property abroad on the basis that you're going to get a slightly lesser income, but you would rent it out to a professional couple or someone who is local to the area where you bought the property, and they will look after the property for you. And I think you should see it more as what John and Paul do, as an investment rather than a lifestyle change, because you've got someone in there, you won't be able to occupy it yourself, either temporarily or fully. And you know, you see it as a return on your investment. These two keep going on about return on investment and all the rest of it. Well, as long as you keep the client there, the tenant there, you've got a return on your investment. You've got to see it as something that is going up in capital appreciation, and also return by way of rental income. But it is, yes, more difficult, and yes, it is fraught with difficulties. And I'm not saying no, don't do it. You know, the English market is what it is. The international market is a totally different market.
I guess.
Stefano, sorry. So I'm just going to very quickly ask, in terms of capital growth, have they seen the same amounts of capital growth, perhaps, that the UK market's seen over the years in principle, and have they had the recessions as well? Property recessions? Yes,
absolutely. Property recessions, of course, we've had the property recessions, 2007, 2008, the whole world got a property recession. So yes, I mean, in Spain, when I do my seminars, I say that in Spain, for example, overnight property prices went down 40%. In Italy, 25%, 30%, in France, 20, 30%. But Spain took the real hit. Yes, it's a totally different market, John. I mean, you can't equate the two. No. At the end of the day, we've had the recessions. Property. I mean, I always say to people see, if you go to the best example is France. And people buy in France. If you look on the property markets now, you'll see that properties have gone down 30% in the last 2 months in France. But that does not mean to say that you will get a great price when you come to sell it in 10 years' time. Lots of people who sell their properties now have been trying to sell their property in France and Italy and Spain and less so Portugal, have a problem in either selling it or getting the price they wanted. It's the case that if you invest £100,000 into a property in France and then you do some works to it, you might not get back what you have invested in it on the purchase price. Why? Because it's not that sort of market. You will only get your money back in France, for example, in places like Paris, the major cities, if you're going to do flats investments like John and Paul do, or if you go to seaside resorts like Saint-Tropez, Cannes, Nice, and places like that, Marseille, where there is a high demand for people. You know, I did one last week for a client, completed one last week for a client who bought in Mougins, which is just outside Cannes. She paid 6.5 million quid for it, euros for it. Oh. So she will get her money back because that's one of the trendy areas. But if you go to the Vienne, if you go to one of the other Dordogne, you're not always, even the famous areas, they're not always areas where you will get your money back. And you've not got to see it, unfortunately, that way, because investment abroad has different criteria to investment like Paul and John. I mean, Paul's always saying, isn't he, that, you know, he wouldn't invest abroad because it, you know, it's totally wrong and this, that and the other. But it's two different frames of mind. You know, I'm investing abroad at the moment because I want to buy something. I want to buy something for my cookery school and for my spa, and it's a lifestyle change. But I'd like to think.
I take it we're going to come to the opening. Lucia will definitely get.
Lucia's booked. Lucia's booked for a course of yoga. She's doing some of her yoga there.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, comments.
Say again.
Sorry, finish, Savannah.
No, right. It was just to say that two markets are totally different, and there are people who want to invest abroad, and there are people who want to invest in the United Kingdom. The two are totally separate. You've got to consider what you want at the end. What do you want? And mainly, investing abroad is a lifestyle change. It's return.
It comes down to what we always say. It's what was the intention in the first place? You know, where do you want to go with it? And there are obviously very different things as to whether you're just looking at it purely financially. Or for your lifestyle, or you know, whatever investment. So
So just a couple of comments on that, guys, and points I probably made before, but I agree with what Stefan has said there, in that if it is solely for investment, and if you're solely doing it to make money, it doesn't make much sense in my mind to be buying abroad, because one big reason is you're playing the foreign exchange.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what the pound versus the euro is going to do over the next 10 years. And that could benefit you, or it could wipe out your returns through no fault or logic of your own. So that doesn't make much sense to me. And also, Lano said, so far as they are more cyclical markets. You know, for example, a friend of mine bought a holiday home / investment on a golf course in Portugal, and when the recession hit, that golf course shut. So he went from having a lovely house on a golf course to having a lovely house in a desert. So, you know, you're right. It's a lifestyle thing. Sometimes people get confused between lifestyle and investment. They should be two completely separate things.
I agree with you. I would describe it as using walkabout money, bit of fun money, compared to, you know, business money is how I would describe it, probably. But you don't sound a lot of fun, Paul, to be fair. I mean, a lot of people love to buy abroad. The UK's got we're the biggest buyers abroad, aren't we? In Europe, I think.
Well, that's probably why it's so cyclical, because you have wealthy British people who will splash all their money on these £1 million properties in Marbella. Yeah. But when the recession hits, they need those millions of pounds back.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, no, I understand that.
I mean, last year, 990,000 registrations took place in Spain. Now, not all of them were British. 65% of those registrations were British.
Right. Wow.
990,000.
Yes.
And 65% were British.
Yeah.
You mean registrations as in getting an NIE number? And...
No. As in people, land registrations, i.e. completion.
Right.
65%.
That's unbelievable, isn't it? Unbelievable.
Wow.
And they're not all big things. I mean, in Spain, you can start off at 30,000, 20,000, 30,000.
Yeah, that's my limit.
That's interesting. That's nearly 1% of the UK population have bought in.
Yeah.
That's
included. Although it wasn't last year, it was a bit longer than that. Okay, let's move on to John's next question then for today.
Good.
This person says, I am in the process of purchasing a partly finished 2-flat conversion from a house. What are the things that you would say I have got to look out for and be aware of?
Goodness me. I mean, with opportunity, quite often comes risk. So the bigger the opportunity, potentially the bigger the risk of things going wrong. So when you buy any property, be it a house or in this case, they're buying 2 flats, which is being converted from a house, you really need to know what has been done. And more importantly, has that work been done correctly? Because if it hasn't been done correctly, it needs to be started all over again. So any benefit you might think you've got by, you know, some of the work being done may have to be destroyed. And I'm very suspicious of, and I, you know, buy lots of properties that are part finished. And I'm always incredibly suspicious as why is it part finished? Because normally it's because the people have either run out of money, which tends to suggest that they weren't very organised in the first place, and may suggest they've taken shortcuts on the work. So the very first thing I do is ring up the building inspector at the council and say, right, what do you know about this building? You know, check the planning, check it's got planning. That's the first thing, because it may not even have planning. Check the planning, check that they applied for building regulation approval, and check that the building inspector's been out to check the work that's been done. And you can always get them to come out. The building inspector will come out and advise you as to what's been done, what hasn't been done. So that's the very first thing to do. Very, very important. It should ring alarm bells that it's part finished, is what I'm really saying.
Right. Okay. And would you is there any other things they've said? What else have I got to look out for? Is there any other?
That's
you know,
it.
One point that comes to mind for me is the warranties from the previous builder.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm assuming, to be fair, Paul, that, you know, if there's, you know, these days, if you're converting 2 flats to sell them, you need a 10-year warranty on them. And of course, you know, the chances are that they haven't applied for a warranty. And if they have, like Paul said, it may not be accepted. But all that sort of stuff is your solicitor will be asking the other side solicitor all those facts. Now, if there isn't a warranty in place, you can get one put in retrospectively. So it costs a little bit more, but if you're halfway through the project or whatever, you should be fine. Yeah, there are companies that do that now. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Well, that brings our questions here for this episode to a close. If you do have any questions for us, please just write them in the comments below, or you can send an email to ask at aquestionofproperty.co.uk. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much to Paul, Stefano and John, and we'll see you again.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.